What I have here is a text, a very fresh text written. It's a short version of the paper that I intend to publish in the end. I'm just going to read the text because that's what I did here. It's literally the text to read. I think the text is clear enough, and then I write the doubts, the questions, everything for the end. Okay. I'll ask you to follow me with the reading. Okay. Okay, it's a purified one. Skip. It's quite trivial that Vedanta is defined as a philosophy or a philosophical school. However, the correspondence of these concepts from different cultural origins is not as self-evident as it might seem. And it took a whole historical construction for India's traditional schools of thought, called darshanas, literally visions in Sanskrit or views, to be academically incorporated as philosophy. Ask a teacher who has been educated in this tradition of Vedanta what she or he thinks about it, and it's very likely that she or he will reply that it's not philosophy. It's not philosophy, given the misunderstanding that an inappropriate image can lead to in terms of the subject and the purpose of the teaching. On the other hand, there are also factual reasons that can explain our temptation, so to say, to see parallels between the traditions of thought that emerged from ancient Greece and India. For both are linked by language, since Sanskrit and Greek belong to the same linguistic family, the Indo-European. They share prehistoric cultural heritage from the Bronze Age civilizations of the ancient Near East, especially in Mesopotamia. They were in contact with each other when they belonged to the Persian Empire and maintained intense trade during the Alexandrian and Roman periods. My source for this information in general is this author Thomas McEvely. But however, as I have already indicated in the title of this presentation, Vedanta is a teaching based on the sacred scriptures of the Hindu Vedas, especially in their final sections called Upanishads, and whose subject is only one, Brahman, the one supreme being. It is necessary to investigate how and why Vedanta came to be classified as a philosophy in the 19th century, because historical theories about the inter-civilizational relationship will not explain the crux of the matter, as I see, namely the fact that they belong to quite different and independent traditions. As I see, the best way to clarify this subject in a way that is less biased by Western practice is to learn what Vedanta is from the very elements of the Orthodox Vedic tradition. In other words, we should try as far as possible to put aside the word philosophy, which is a kind of an obstacle in front of us now, and all that it brings to mind, put away until we form a clearer idea of it, so that the point of analogy between the two phenomena becomes more evident. The aim of the Vedanta is to elucidate the student's doubts regarding Brahman and its relationship to the individual, Jiva, by correcting misunderstandings, Vidya, removing any superimposed ideas until it becomes clearly to him that Brahman is not distinct from the self, Atma, insofar as he is the very consciousness, Chaitanya, the witness to everything. In this way, the teachings of the Upanishads, expressed in a mysterious, poetic, sometimes apparently contradictory way, only acquire univocal meaning in their interpretation and transmission by a teacher, acharya or guru, to his students, shishas, always within a specific lineage, parampara, and therefore respect for the heritage of knowledge left by tradition is a central value. Another important point is that the teaching of Vedanta is geared towards, so to say, individual practical realization, insofar as it presents itself as a discipline capable of guiding the student, who must be a truly qualified person, a kari, for this study, to guide him towards a radical change in his way of considering things. The result of this learning is the subject's self-recognition as free, mukta, in particular free from all karma, all and suffering, and yeah, recognize self-recognition as eternal, just like Brahman. For, as the Mundaka Upanishad puts it, I quote, when a man comes to know the highest Brahman, he himself becomes that very Brahman. I don't know what happened with the slides because some of my italics disappeared and the diagrammation is, I think, it's not perfect, but yeah, just to say. Thus, it's fundamental for the students to be able to see and experience in himself, that is, in the immediacy of his inner perception, anubhava, that supreme reality that the Upanishads point out as being identical to the self, which occurs when his egoism, ahamkara, is stripped away by knowledge of Atman in its deepest meaning. Meanwhile, the revealed word of the scripture serves as an anchor in the search for this understanding, giving its divine authority, preventing the deviant digressions typical of strictly rational thought. As Shankaracharya writes, although reasoning may be noted to have finality in some contexts, still in the present context, yeah, it's in the middle of an explanation. So, still in the present context, it cannot possibly get any immunity from the charge of being inconclusive. The reasoning cannot get any immunity from the charge of being inconclusive. For this extremely sublime subject matter, concerned with the reality of the cause of the universe and leading to the goal of liberation, moksha, cannot even be guessed without the help of the Vedas. And we said that it cannot be known either through perception, being devoid of form, etc., or through inference, etc., being devoid of the grounds of inference, etc. The authority of the Vedas is not up for debate, and this is precisely what gives stability to the knowledge transmitted by the Vedanta school. After all, there is no question as to why it was revealed this way and not that way, but rather the aim is simply to understand the sacred truth. If scripture cannot be false, then the controversies about its meaning are produced by the intellectual limitations of human beings, which render inconclusive what's perfect and complete itself. Furthermore, Brahman is neither something sensorially perceptible, a chaksha, nor inferable and mana, and therefore not something about which human beings can speculate only. As Dilip Londo, which is my tutor in this project, by the way, as he expressed it, we shouldn't be taken in by the impulse of discursive reification with regard to Vedanta, as if it followed the same logic focused on the substantialization of the concept present in Western philosophical discourse, because its instructional language doesn't really pretend to account for its subject matter, because Brahman itself is as unknowable to us as the eye is to its own vision. And this, I'm just quoting a metaphor from the Kena Upanishad. What matters is where the reflection and discipline required for study lead the person existentially and morally. This is what matters. With this, the method of Vedanta serves only to clear the path, so to say, that is to remove obstacles to Vidya, the true knowledge, so as to dispel all illusion, Maya, leaving one only with the direct contemplation of the liberating truth that Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. As for what is contained in such a maxim, Mahavakya, again, the words are not the most important thing, but rather, as Hatha puts it, the altered state of consciousness to which they are supposed to lead, granting, quoting him again, granting freedom from the repeated cycle of lives. As it ends. So it is true that the description of Vedanta I have just provided is not without bias. For my own emphasis are already in a way derived from the mode of teaching of the Advaita Vedanta school, sub-school of Shankaracharya, which has the non-duality of Atman Brahman as its pedagogical focus. The other sub-schools would not really be discussed here, as my main interest is in examining how Shankara has become for many the ultimate representation of the philosophy of Vedanta, especially since the work of a certain author. I'm referring to Paul Deussen, the German philosopher, Indologist, historian of philosophy, and educator whose philosophical thought is the subject of my PhD, who, as Nicholson wrote, was more than any single thinker, the responsible for the opinion that Advaita Vedanta was the genuine representative of the Upanishads. In fact, Deussen even went beyond this opinion, having said that Shankara is equal in rank to Plato and Kant, and one of the most valuable products of the genius of mankind in his researches of the eternal truth. This in the second half of the 19th century. So I'd like to reflect on how Advaita Vedanta influenced or may have influenced Deussen in his interpretation of both Indian philosophy and philosophy in general, which is based on the notion of the one eternal truth common to all. The eine allein gemeinsame ewige Wahrheit. It's not well written. My suggestion is that by including Shankara in the high ranks of the great philosophers and theologians, Deussen ends up in a way Vedantizing the Western approach to philosophy and theology, especially Christian philosophy. Also something that he kind of creates when he names philosophy of the Bible. This was convenient for him since his main goal was to formulate a way of thinking that reconciles science and religion in the West. Deussen's dedication to this mission, so to say, turned him one of the forerunners in the intercultural and interreligious dialogue between India and the West. His universalized vision of Vedanta was even influential in the process that culminated in India's independence, reaching figures such as Vivekananda and Gandhi. In short, Deussen adopts a comparative and non-dogmatic, that is, inclusive approach to philosophy, whose main inspiration was Schopenhauer's work, which shaped, as he said in his autobiography, a harmonious whole in his mind by uniting the restricted demands of science with the equally irrefutable needs of the religious mind in a fully satisfying way, like religion in the secular age. That's kind of a preoccupation. He believed that he had found the Philosophus Christianissimus in Schopenhauer because of the clear way in which the essence of Christian theology is translated in Schopenhauer's doctrine of the denial of the will to life into a purely philosophical manner. But we shouldn't deceive ourselves. For Schopenhauer had been deeply interested in the Vedanta, and I put between brackets Advaita also, and I can explain this later, through Orientalist sources since 1814, as his manuscripts show, absorbing ideas that remained in his thoughts during the 4 years before the completion of his magnum opus and beyond. What Deussen did was to take his master's essential philosophical views on India and work on them at the level of Indological work, thus producing scientific results that Schopenhauer could not, and disseminating complete knowledge of the Indian tradition that he did not have. Not really complete, but this is the title I gave to the second part of the Paul Deussen, Vedanta and the Philosophical Truth as Universal Bridge. Deussen was the founder of the chair of Indian philosophy studies in Germany, and his work is one of the most notorious milestones in the reception of Vedanta in Europe. He's known to this day for the quality of his Sanskrit translations and the philosophical depth of his analysis of Indian thought, especially Vedanta. It's safe to say that before Deussen, the Indian Darshanasts had not yet received all the dignity that the word philosophy carries in the West. For Indian thought was not studied as a tradition that dialogued with European traditions, but rather, see Hegel, was seen as an infantile, childish, or primitive stage of history, and therefore as something already surpassed as a merely historical value. Deussens' work, Allgemeine Geschichte der Philosophie, Universal History of Philosophy with special regard to religions, is the first not to have presupposed the Indian inferiority. On the contrary. On the contrary, for Deussen, Indian philosophy was the most profound and the Vedanta a great support for Christian moral doctrine. As he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself because you are your neighbor, and mere illusion, right, Maya, makes you believe that your neighbor is something different from yourself. And here I quote a passage from this German theologian called Joseph Kuschel. What just matters here is that he is pointing out that he chose Vedanta to be the support of Christian theology in a way that it can even imply, as he say, that you don't have to be a Christian to demand loving your neighbor, because you can find this already, the fundaments for that, at least in the Vedanta philosophy. As Kuschel suggests, because he sought to better understand his Christian point of view, Deussen relied on the Vedanta understanding that it metaphysically supports the core of Christian doctrine, which is, to him, morality. But I would say, to the extent that Vedanta becomes for him the explanation of Christianity, Christianity ends up becoming, in a way, also a form of Vedanta, in a way. Deussen, for whom the various religions were only different interpretations given the same common core, as he says, religion is only interpretation of moral consciousness. He cared little for this consequence, this Vedantization of the Christian religion. I don't know. For him, it was certainly something valid in the fight against materialism as a modern anti-religious and anti-metaphysical tendency. Deussen tried to rehabilitate Christian theology through a philosophical revision that would be able to reconcile religious feeling and scientific conscience. His aim was to fill the metaphysical and moral void that the expansion of the materialist worldview entailed, which was in line with the Deussens' view, was in line with this American transcendentalist thinking of that century. It's something that I also argue in my thesis. It's not something that you're going to find in the books, but it's true. Because the first book he published was related to that, and it's a trend related to his family, to his family tradition. So such a philosophical standpoint of reconciliation of all oppositions, as he says in his the elements of metaphysics, would also highlight the inner agreement of Christian truth with other truths. So I quote him: the Brahman of the Indians, the ideas of Plato, the creator and savior of the world of Christianity, the thing in itself of Kant, the forces in the natural sciences, and the will of Schopenhauer, forming an unbreakable, also quoting him, unbreakable whole of metaphysics. Thus, without making conservative dogmatic appeals, Deussen intended to save Christianity by demonstrating that its truth is eternal, and that although the Bible is indeed a revelation, he doesn't deny that, it should not be taken literally or as a historical source, but interpreted in a deeper sense. As he says, all revelations, wherever they may have occurred, are outward projections of inner processes, he writes. But this does not diminish their value and metaphysical dignity in the least, because our own inner being is the only point in nature where we become aware of the thing in itself and thus the epitome of everything divine. End of quotation. So Deussen does emphasize the educational importance of religions in transmitting metaphysical truths. According to him, religions are themselves philosophy when viewed internally and after stripping off the mythical garb. In other words, there will be an objective truth linked to each tradition and therefore a philosophy to be extracted, which is independent of faith and superstition. This is how Deussen achieves what he calls biblical philosophy, that is, by taking the Bible critically and regarding not the myth, but as he says, the Christ in us, in the moral consciousness. So who was Deussens methodological inspiration in proposing such a philosophical approach to the Bible? The answer is Shankara, as he himself puts it. Shankara has found a wonderful device which deserves the attention, perhaps the imitation of the Christian dogmatics and their embarrassments. He constructs out of materials of the Upanishads two systems, one esoteric, philosophical, called by him Nirguna Vidya, sometimes Paramarthika Avastha, containing the metaphysical truth for the few ones, rare in all times and countries, who are able to understand it, for who are able to understand it. And another exoteric theological, Saguna Vidya Vyavaharika Avastha, for the general public who wants images, not abstract truth, worship, not meditation. Inspired by the methodological example of Shankara, as well as that of the spiritually related, as he likes to say that, Schopenhauer, in his division between sensu allegorical and sensu proprio truth, sensu allegorical and truth sensu proprio, Deussen proposed that in Christianity, that is the eternal salvation doctrine of denial, which presents itself as the surrender of one's own sinful will to a wholly personally conceived will, that there is a theological shell for those who seek salvation through worship and a philosophical core for those who seek the same through knowledge. As Deussen says, according to the Vedantic view, as Shankara explains in the Buddha Upanishad, this Veda, the Veda is divided into two parts, which show a far-reaching analogy with the Old and New Testaments. A part of works, karma kanda, and that which contains the mantras and brahmanas in general, and a part of knowledge, jnana kanda, which contains the Upanishads and what belongs to them. As Deussen insists, such an analogy is Vedas, Upanishads, Old Testament, New Testament, would not be, I call it a merely external and accidental one, but one which goes into great depth and is founded in this was my emphasis, in a general law of development of religious life, which appears in both fields. Thus, Deussen, he does his best to make this approximation between Vedanta and Christianity to make it to make it palpable to his contemporaries, despite the historical anachronism. For example, by comparing the great religious and philosophical reformer Shankara, as he says, to another great reformer, Luther. I'm gonna skip this also. But yeah, when Deussen says in this passage that Shankara pushes the other systems aside, here, yeah, I have to go back. Yeah, just as Luther, through the clouding traditions of the Middle Ages, Uh, no, no. Shankara pushes aside the Sankhya system and Buddhism with a vehemence of polemics that does honor to Luther, and acknowledges only the scriptures, the Veda, the Upanishads as superhuman authority. So when he says that Shankara pushes the other systems aside, he's referring to his theory that history of Indian philosophy begins at its peak and declines until atheistic doctrines such as Sankhya and Buddhism gain, until these doctrines gain predominance. And following a trend that, according to him, would be natural to any historical process of the transmission of philosophical knowledge, transmission of philosophical knowledge. In this sense, the progressive rise of materialism in Europe, that's how he thinks, this progressive rise of materialism as an enlightened standpoint associated with the natural sciences, combined with all kinds of attempts to adapt the Christian view to this standpoint of materialism. These seem to Deussen to be a repetition of the same general picture of, so to say, spiritual crisis that occurred at the time of Shankara, which should also be countered by taking him as a model. Well, in Deussen's context, there was only one way of reconciliation, which is the Kantian way, because all the others were based on purely materialistic thinking, which is only empirical and falls short of the transcendental perspective from Kant. Therefore, but there's an analogy between Kant and Shankara. Kant kind of represents Shankara in the modern Western society, since he was chosen to play the same role, even though Kant is not actually a religious reformer. But for Deussen, he complements the Vedanta by teaching about the natural constitution of our cognitive faculty, as he says. All these statements indicate that the ultimate ground of the false empirical view should be sought where the Vedanta did not seek it, namely in the natural constitution of our cognitive faculty. An analysis of it, such as Kant undertook, would indeed provide the true scientific substructure of the Vedanta system, and it is to be hoped, he says, that the Indians whose orthodox dogmatics are still valid today, 19th century, we are presenting here, will adopt the teachings of the critique of pure reason and respect, and blah, blah, blah. So, it would therefore be the modern equivalent or similar of Shankara, which would have cleared the way for recognizing the legitimacy of religion and its fundamental importance in human life. Take, for example, this work, it's a pseudo-scientific work called Die Welt als Staat. It's a work by a botanist, German botanist called Johannes Reich. He's called a vitalist in general, but yeah, it's a good example because while allegedly trying to break away from materialism in this work, the Welt als Staat, it proposed the idea that natural events are not just a result of causal processes governed by physical laws, but also of the dominance of creative and intelligent physical forces, like a cosmical reason, which would direct everything in the universe, giving them a rational purpose. Like, it's a case of how science can be misunderstood at its limit, with an invasion of theological notions that are assumed to be physical entities, which is it's a kind of a betrayal of both science and Christian religion, which after being expelled by modern rationality, came back through the back door. And Deussen wrote his essay on the essence of idealism, exactly as a reaction to this work by Hayek that he doesn't even quote in the essay, but he mentioned in the autobiography anyways, but they were colleagues in the Kiel University. So that Deussen signaled for the importance of understanding cosmic intelligence in idealist terms. The world is a representation for consciousness, and we cannot get out of it any more than a crab out of its shell. Okay. Shankara, who was indeed very important for the rescue of Vedic tradition at a time that when it was weakened by the advance of heretical traditions. It is true, but and he renewed the teaching of Vedanta on the basis of the exegetical reform and logical argumentation against the rival schools and this doctrine of two science. Which basically provides a critical reading of the Upanishad doctrine. This is a kind of a model for Deussen in this dispute against materialism in the 19th century. So let's focus on this last front again, this two-level truth. Shankara goes on to distinguish in the scripture what's content, what in its content does justice to the empirical standpoint as a pedagogical adaptation to the common understanding of things, and what touches directly on the subject of redemptive metaphysics, which is tatomasi, which is, this is this or that is you. It's directly focused on redemption regarding the identification with Brahman. So Deussen summarizes such reasoning, which tends to minimize the efficacy of worldly actions and exalts knowledge as the main means of salvation. In his work systematizing the Brahma Sutras from the perspective of Shankara, he says, Jnana moksha. So how is deliverance, moksha from the bondage of existence possible? Not by works. For these, the good as well as the bad demands a retribution and thus condition a new existence and are the cause of the continuation of samsara. But also not by moral purification, for such a purification can only take place in an object capable of change. But the Atman, the soul whose redemption is at stake, is unchangeable. Therefore, salvation cannot consist in becoming something or doing something, but only in the realization of something that already exists, but is hidden by ignorance. From knowledge, redemption. Let's put it this way. The Vedanta method, for its much more a method of instruction than a doctrine, as Dilip Londo points out, it wants to lead the student to moksha. That's its goal, its reason for being. In other words, it ensures that everyone can find their way there, albeit gradually, at the cost of accommodations to human weakness, to use an expression by Deussen. Each image and word highlighted depends on the explanatory needs required here and now, always within a certain context of doubt. It depends on the doubt. And from a certain point of view, this resembles Deussen's characteristic way of teaching philosophy, which basically teaches the same general Kantian Schopenhauerian thought, only changing the words according to what the context calls for. As he writes in his autobiography about the time he replaced his father as a pastor of the evangelical church in Braz, it gave me a great satisfaction, quote him, it gave me a great satisfaction to dress the philosophical views I had gained through Kant and Schopenhauer in the traditional ecclesiastical forms. So he was literally doing that. So finally, Deussen's work very clearly demonstrates his respect for Shankara, and it is also clear that his influence and that the Upanishad is present in his thoughts as a kind of a master gear that makes his machine turn along with other very important ones. Parmenides, Plato, Plotinus, Jesus and Paul, Kant and Schopenhauer, to say the main. Firstly, the eternal philosophical truth that is in fact unattainable by human minds, because it's divine, proposed by Deussen, has an analogy with Brahman as the inexhaustible subject of the sacred Upanishads. And secondly, the two-level vision of truth is in a way analogous to Deussen's discernment in his universal history of philosophy, between, on the one hand, the individual and traditional elements, and on the other, the original element of each system. So it's not even only the philosophy of religion, it's also an influence in his historical interpretation of the history of philosophy. So therefore, as I have seen it, Shankara's critical method would not only have influenced Doyson's thought within the strict field of Indian philosophy or even philosophy of religion. Just repeating. The influence is pervasive and needs to be observed, Shankara's influence, in its mutual interaction with the other major influence. And I think this is the crucial point also, is to see the correlation with the other influences and the results from that. And I draw special attention to the similarities regarding the integrative way in which truth is defined and studied in both cases. Because in Doyson's case, is something that distinguishes him from the other historians. So yeah, thank you. That's it.